presents pretty much every year at least one program at Wilderness Wildlife. She's involved with Quilt Fest. She's a storyteller. She's a local tour guide. Just all kinds of wonderful things. So we're excited to have her. This program we actually saw at Wilderness, called Colonial America, and I was like, yeah, we're gonna have that. We want to get Kathy here for our America 250 programming. So thank you all for being here. This Thursday night we will have Becky and Dave Weaver. They are traditional chair caners and basket weavers, husband and wife duo. They have most of their items at Cliff Dwellers out in Gatlinburg. So come back at 6 o'clock on Thursday if you can join us. And otherwise, here's Miss Kathy Gwinn.
Thank you so much, Christina. Appreciate that. And, it's something that's sort of funny. I told Marcia I thanked her for letting me come and do this presentation of the 250th, because I said, chances are there's a pretty good chance I won't be around in 2076.
Some of us are old enough to see both of them, right?
Yeah. Well, you know what? When I thought about this, I thought about when I was 16 years old and I was watching the bicentennial of 1976, and Gerald Ford was the president, and we had just come out of Watergate a couple years before. And I thought about that because it made me think that was a hard time for America. It was a very divided, weak time. But then with the celebration of 76, that really was a great spurt for patriotism and unifying our country. And the question came to my mind, well, 250, does it have the potential to do the same thing for America? I sure hope it does or can. But because we all want to be good citizens and celebrate our country, but we also have to be realistic. And it's very sad to say, because we are in a time where as a country, we are very, very divided. But that was not what I was here to say. But anyway, so I do want to thank you for coming tonight. And I got to put these old lady readers on, okay? I used to teach history. I taught American history and government. And I have to say the Founding Fathers, as writers and as statesmen, were some of my favorite. I want to give you a quote from Thomas Jefferson. He once wrote about himself and the other Founding Fathers. He said, "Not one of us is perfect. No, not one. We are revolting." And they were. But not in the sense that we use that revolting word today, like disgusting. They were revolting. And revolt, that word comes from a Latin word that means to literally turn over, to change in a very, very dramatic way, and to turn something completely upside down. And that is what our Founding Fathers, the revolutionaries, were really, truly doing. With a revolt, you have a whole new way of looking at life, looking at your responses to life, how you perceive things. And for them especially, they were re-evaluating the way people had been literally governed for hundreds upon hundreds of years. So the revolutionaries had several questions. And you can imagine sometimes they were maybe plagued with the path that they were going down. Is it the absolute best path, the right path? And so they would ask themselves, is democracy truly, truly possible? Another question, in a country this size, is self-governing even a possibility? Is human nature noble enough to govern itself? Those were very, very difficult questions, and nobody, in all honesty, could answer those questions with 100% certainty. Because in terms of governing, we were looking at a whole new paradigm. And so I say all of that for us to appreciate the trepidation that they must have felt at different times. You know, when I lived in Fargo, I taught Reformation history, and I taught it at our local university. And the more I taught it, the more I began to appreciate the trepidation, the weight on Martin Luther's shoulders. He said, sometimes the thought would come to me, what if I am wrong? What if I am leading a whole group of people down the wrong path? Well, there were times our founding fathers also had that concern. Another reason that would cause them some trepidation, when we think back of colonial America in these times, the revolutionaries made up 1/3 of the total population of the 2.5 million people living in the colonies at that time. 1/3 were revolutionaries. Another third were loyalists. They supported King George, England, the crown, and all that meant. And then another third were totally neutral. So for men like Thomas Jefferson, was it truly, truly right for them if they were trying to force or push this idea of independence upon the people? Because would not that totally fly in the face of democracy and the values that they were really trying to instill? And so as I get started, I want to paint a picture that this was not easy. And there's always, when you have a big change and a new way of looking at things and turning them over, there's always trepidation involved with that. But one thing that perhaps really helped, I would say, our founding fathers and the revolutionaries, is that the more the colonists lived in this new land, the more they were becoming distinctly American. So think about it. You come over to this new land, and all of a sudden, there's new crops, there's new foods that you had never been exposed to. There's whole different species of trees and plants. There's new types of animals. There's completely new landscapes. Plus, there was the experience they had of crossing the ocean. That in itself would change them. Plus, once they got here, they were now to interact with a group of indigenous people. And now it was time to tame a wilderness. All those things, and nobody in England could relate to them. You have a whole gamut of new experiences and new surroundings. Think about it. New experiences necessitate new responses, new ways of thinking, right? And in that process, we forge a whole new American character and psyche. And so, as this happens, England and its people are less and less able to identify with what we call these new Americans. I'll tell you, last summer, my husband and I, we went to Austria and the Czech Republic and Hungary. And I love to go to Europe because I love old things. My husband says he's grateful for that, which is ironic. I'm older than him, but anyway. But we went to many old cities, fortified cities that were from the 800s and 900s. And they would have ramparts. They would have the old city gates, the cobblestone streets. They'd still have the old powder magazines where years and years ago, all of your ammunition was stored. And what amazed me more than the fact of how old they were is how well preserved they were. And I turned to Mike and I said, you know what? Us Americans don't preserve anything. And I realized that in our American character and development, preservation did not really start as a value part of our character or our country. And think about it. If you move into a new wilderness and you basically got as much room as you want to take, and you can eventually manifest destiny, go from coast to coast, they weren't as concerned about just preserving this one little street, this one small little town, and we have no room to grow. So we've got to keep these buildings up. We've got to keep this cathedral up in our streets because room was of the essence. They were preservationists, but we didn't have that issue here. But then also there's another thing that probably makes us uniquely American and lacking in a strong preservationist attitude, and that is the fact that a whole grouping of people who have in their mind and the wherewithal to say, you know what, we're going to pick up everything. We're going to pull up all our stakes and we are going on to a new land that we've never seen, we've never known before. That's the type of people Americans were. And you know, when we got here, we realized out of survival mode, we would have to put practicality over protocol. We'd have to put function over form, and we'd have to put expediency over tradition. And those things are what were woven into our character in the very beginning of the formation of our country to make us uniquely American. So that may be part of the reason we're a Walmart people. Or a Walmart generation. That was a lot of philosophy you're thinking just to get to that point. But what I want to do is talk about the Revolution and colonial times and how even the response to Britain and to increased taxation became a uniquely American response. And probably one of the very, very best examples of this is the Boston Tea Party, okay? Now, Britain had just raised another tax, one of many. This time it would be on tea. And they were putting a new tax of 1 penny per pound of tea. Now, even in the 1770s, think about it. Was that outrageous? Absolutely not. But boy, did it create a stir. And in fact, how did the Boston colonialists respond? In a very, very American way. What did they do? They painted their faces red, they put some feathers in their hair, and then they got some blankets from the Mohawk tribe and put them around their shoulders. Try doing that in England. Uniquely American. But another reason it was a very, very uniquely American response. Almost 20 years before this, the American colonies were involved in the French and Indian War. And just a little short recap on that. That was between France and England, and those two countries wanted to have dominion and rule the Northwest Territory, basically Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And they were fighting over that. Well, the colonists that time were involved in that war with England. And there was a British surgeon who in 1755 wrote a song. You would know it today. It is called Yankee Doodle Dandy. And what this doctor was basically saying to these ragtag colonialists who thought they were some type of soldier, he was saying, oh, you Americans, you're doodles. Because in England, what was a doodle? A doodle was a simpleton, a lowlife, a nobody. Yankee Doodle. He said those Americans, those soldiers, they think all they need to do is put a feather in their cap, and lo and behold, they'll become a macaroni. A macaroni was someone in England of great, great breeding, had quite the background in terms of their heritage, aristocrats, years of culture, education. And he said, you can't do that. So, by the colonists sticking a feather in their hair at the Boston Tea Party, it was also a rejection of that song, Yankee Doodle Dandy. Okay? So, but the Boston Tea Party, I want to share two things, why tea and why Boston, okay? And if you guys have questions along the way, please do feel free. I'm not that rigid or whatever that at any point you can ask. But I will tell you this, I was on a bus today, talking away, just yapping away. And I said, are there any questions? And a lady was about to raise her hand and ask a question, and her husband gave her a good nudge. And she said, oh, please, honey, it will only encourage her. So anyway, but why tea? Britain had started almost 10 years earlier with the Stamp Act of putting a tax on newspapers, on cards, on letters, and there were many taxes since then. So why did they get so outraged about tea that it was enough to cause this tea party? Well, if we were living at this time, we would realize that tea was very, very British. Everything about tea said Britain, okay? It said, I had a British upbringing, a British past. I know British protocol and traditions. This is something that I have inherited, and it's something I'm continuing. So tea said British. So it became actually a political commodity And if you wanted to support the colonies and America, then it was un-American to drink tea. So you better find a substitute quick. All right, what were your substitutes? Probably coffee, but also they were making blackberry tea, a raspberry tea, and they also would use goldenrod. If you did any one of these substitutes, you were drinking liberty, okay? And anyway, so that's part of the issue. It was a rejection of England. And if you no longer consumed tea, there couldn't be a bigger slap in King George's face. So that's the first reason. The second reason, I oftentimes go back to the context because it's very, very different than today. If you think of tea, in colonial time, it was a very refined tradition. There was a protocol to it, and there was a whole slew of paraphernalia that went with the tea culture. Because if I have tea, I need to have a teapot. I need to have a tea kettle. I need to have teacups. Often the teapot and the cups were porcelain coming from China, expensive. Okay, I need to have tongs. I need to have linens. I have sugar cubes. There were all these things that went with tea. And if you and I were an average colonialist, we would not have been drinking tea because we could not have afforded it. It would have been way beyond us. You know what? In fact, the average American, infant, child, adult, was drinking in colonial America? Apple juice, not water. We could not drink the water in our municipalities, towns, villages, because they were so unsafe because they were contaminated. We have to remember in the 16 and 1700s, if you did have a community, that all the animals and people still had a milk cow. They still had to have a horse for transportation. They might still have a few mules just for toting things. And so all those farm critters, their waste went somewhere. Well, it was the nearest water source. And then these were still the days of a good old chamber pot. And your scullery maid, if you had one, what was the very, very first thing they did every morning? Change that chamber pot, okay? That would go into the nearest water source. So our waters were very, very contaminated. And this is why apple juice and apples were so, so important to America in colonial times. Did you realize that in the New England states and the Mid-Atlantic states, when those colonies were formed, if you had purchased land, it was a law that you planted apple trees immediately on your land. Because an apple tree was the difference between starvation and survival. Ever heard of a man by the name of Johnny Appleseed? John Chapman from Massachusetts. And he went through West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, went up into Ontario. He went all across the Midwest and the Northwest before pioneers would go there planting apples so that they would have something when they got there. So basically what I'm saying, it was not your average colonialist who drank tea. It was not your average colonialist who started a revolution and had the political thinking and the leadership abilities and the influence and the education and the money and the means to start a revolution. See what I'm saying? The exact same people who were drinking the tea and had that culture were the very same people. The very well-bred, well-educated, those with the money who would be at the forefront of starting this revolution. And of all places, why Boston? Why didn't something very similar happen when they were going into colonial harbor cities at the same time? British merchant ships, the tea was coming from China, but they were on British ships. And why didn't this happen? The three main other harbor cities were New York, Philadelphia, Annapolis, and Charleston, and that makes 4, and I can't count. But anyway, these other 4 cities, why didn't the same thing happen? Well, the colonial governors of those other states never allowed the tea and those merchant ships to come even into the harbors. They were so against England by this time. But the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, was much, much more sympathetic to the crown. He was very divided in his loyalties. And so he said, no, we can't offend the British. We've got to allow the ships to come into the harbor. Well, that may have been how he felt. Okay, Governor Hutchinson, you come down and you unload those ships, or unload those crates. The merchants of Boston refused to allow any of the cargo to leave the ships. So the ship couldn't leave the harbor, and the cargo couldn't leave the ship. So we're at a complete standstill, and that becomes a big, big problem. So why Boston? It was the seat of the radical revolutionaries. Massachusetts was spearheading this. We had men like John Hancock, Sam Adams, his second cousin John Adams, who would later become president, and then we also had people like Paul Revere, and they were taking a great, great stand. We had one especially revolting man by the name of Sam Adams. You can go down the street to Food City today, and if you want to get yourself some Sam Adams brew, you still can. All right, his family had been brewers in the Boston area for many, many years. They were very, very successful, and it was Sam Adams who brewed up the idea of the Boston Tea Party. You see, Sam Adams was a very, very practical man, and his ear was always at the voice of the people. And as part of his business responsibility, he had to travel from tavern to tavern to tavern and also make sure that their brew was distributed. Well, while there, he would talk among the sailors and the workers at the dock and the everyday common people, and he'd hear all their grievances against England. Plus was the fact he didn't go alone. He had a pet dog named Q, and he was a huge Newfoundland. And that dog, somehow, Samuel Adams said he never trained him to do this, but somehow that dog knew a redcoat. And when he saw anybody that was a redcoat, he would just growl at him. Could be very, very intimidating. Plus, he took a bite or two out of a couple. Well, Sam Adams comes up with the idea of all his fellow patriots being known as the Sons of Liberty. That was also his idea. And he said, you know what? Being the Sons of Liberty, that sounds good. That sounds patriotic. It sounds a lot better than the way the British newspapers are reporting us as an unruly mob. So he wanted them to galvanize their support and identity. Something else Sam Adams did that was very, very important, and this was his idea also. We're going to have the Sons of Liberty. I'm going to correspond with leaders, patriot leaders in all the other colonies to form a chapter in each colony and each major city. And then something else I want the Sons of Liberty to do, that I have started in Boston, and I think it will be quite helpful to you. You all need to have a liberty tree, okay? So, starting in 1765, with the very, very first, very aggressive tax called the Stamp Act, is the first time that they met under this huge elm. And that elm was located near the Boston Commons, okay? Well, in the heat of battle, the British would cut it down. And all that was left was a stump. But the Patriots were not about to be defeated, so they put a pole there, and now you met at the Liberty Pole. But in every colony, you were to have a liberty tree. And this was where you would meet and make your plans. And I want you to think about this. Remember what I said about this American character being very, very practical, and everything was for expediency. They started using natural landmarks as your meeting places, okay? We're patriots. We are rebelling against England. That means we cannot use England's buildings to revolt, to plan, to make maneuvers. So we don't have any buildings of our own. So what are we going to do? Well, let's use something we already have and everybody knows where it's at. So there were liberty trees and there were charter oaks, okay, all throughout this time of colonial America as a way to galvanize your support and a way to identify. And so this was another reason, because of the strong, strong support that you had in Massachusetts especially. Okay, so Mr. Sam Adams, the Sons of Liberty. Okay. What was England's response to the Boston Tea Party? Well, for one thing, folks, I'll tell you, it was a slow response because it took quite a while to get back to England. During this time, it would take a couple months before they realized what had happened. And when they were aware, 342 chests of British tea were tossed into the Boston Harbor. And that was $1 million worth of a commodity. And so what did King George and the Parliament decide to do? We're going to completely close down the Boston Harbor, and we're going to make Boston suffer, and we're not reopening that harbor until all the tea is paid for. That didn't work well. The second response, they issued something called the Intolerable Acts. And this was more taxation and more rules and regulations, but actually, rather than helping, now those people who are on the fence and were neutral about this revolution, all of a sudden, these intolerable acts, they decided, yes, it's time. We need to revolt. And so it just put a much, much greater wedge between the colonies and England, but it had a positive effect here in that it united the colonies together much, much more. So 18 months after the Boston Tea Party, war is finally declared with England. You declare war, what do you need? An army. You need an army, and you need a commander-in-chief. And I think you know who I mean. You've probably heard of a man by the name of George Washington, okay? George Washington already was very, very loved, very respected, and very trusted. He wasn't one of those Massachusetts hotheads, okay? And he had military experience, one of the very few that did, because he was engaged in the French and Indian War earlier. But people trusted George Washington, and even his sheer size commanded respect, because by the time he was 16, he was already 6 feet tall. He was a very, very strong man. And when he saw, too, in the French and Indian War, two soldiers fighting, they were on the same team, colonists fighting with each other, he literally picked them both up, one in each arm, and separated them, and then knocked their two heads together. He said, I'm trying to knock some sense into you. All right, but he was extremely strong. But the biggest thing, plus, of having George Washington as our first commander-in-chief, he was from the South. He was from Virginia. And the northern colonies knew, if we want the support of the Carolinas and Georgia and Virginia, we have got to have a Southern general. And even John Hancock and the Adams agreed to that. And so he would be made our first commander-in-chief. Well, I always feel sorry for poor George. I often call him in my little head, poor George, because I've done a lot of studies of first mothers, of presidents and first ladies, and first children, and even I did one on first dogs and pets of people, or of presidents. And George's daddy died when he was 11 years old. He was a Virginia planter. So his mother, who was also a Martha, he married a Martha, but she, the mother, was also a Martha. And she was a very, very large lady, and she smoked a pipe. And the people back, her colleagues back then, said most of the people were quite frightened by Martha Ball, you know, and she would, if she thought that George was misbehaving, she always had a little knife with her, like a little, wasn't a buck knife then, but you know what I mean, a little knife. And she would just go to the nearest peach tree and she would just cut down some switches and she'd just put him to the back of his legs and his bottom. And he really had to toe the line. And she had great dreams for George. And she'd tell him what these dreams were. And she said, George, someday I dream that you will be a man of the cloth. Well, poor, poor Mary. Because when George had to go home and say, they've elected me president, she was so disappointed. She said, President? President? You're kidding. Not a king? No, Mom, president. Well, it had to do. But she was very disappointed because he never became a preacher. And then, so you're given the responsibility of an army, but you need soldiers. And what a group of ragtag soldiers he had to work with. The very, very first of the Continental Army stations was in Cambridge. And do you know, the soldiers were supposed to show up and they're supposed to come with muskets. Many of them did not have any weaponry whatsoever. So, being our practical Americans, these farm boys showed up with pitchforks and sickles, all right, from home. There's that American practicality again. And some of the men who had never ever been to war didn't know how long they would be gone, so they brought their entire families with them, okay? So it was very hard. They didn't have uniforms, and it was like a cesspool, the outhouses, the disease, they were undisciplined. You know, if he would tell the New Jersey volunteers that they have to listen to the people from Connecticut, they said, oh no, they're not nothing but a bunch of nutmeggers, which is what people from Connecticut were called. But he said, we're not listening to them, and the Massachusetts people wouldn't listen to the people from New Jersey, and it was very, very chaotic. And this is what he was given. And he was a spit and polish military man. And so it was very hard for him. And then was the third factor. He's supposed to fight a war, and he has no artillery, no cannons. He's absolutely desperate and very, very discouraged. And there is a man who comes to his rescue, one of his soldiers, who would become a very, very loyal aide to him. His name, Henry Knox. And our town, Knoxville, is named for him. He offered to George Washington, he said, you know what? At Fort Ticonderoga, 300 miles from here, there is a reserve of cannons left over from the French and Indian War. And he said, if you want, I will go get those cannons for you. And George Washington thought, Henry, you're crazy. There's no way. There's these huge mountain gaps, the weight of the artillery, plus you're traveling through the winter, 300 miles. Henry Knox, at the age of 25, he said, let me do this. I can do it. Henry Knox had a bookstore in Boston. He loved books. That was his other passion. He loved books. But from the time he was a little boy, he had all these little toy soldiers that he would play with. And then he'd read books about battles in ancient history and their maneuvering. And with his toy soldiers, he had these little teams and they were fighting it out. He loved the military and planning maneuvers and things like that. And when George Washington saw this, he said, he might be 25, but he's going to be in charge of all the placement of all my cannons. He went to Fort Ticonderoga, and I said, by George, he got all those cannons. It only weighed 120,000 pounds, and he even exceeded what Washington wanted. He also brought, with his oxen and horses, 2,300 pounds of lead that would be melted down and would be put into bullets. So you can see when Washington becomes president why he decides to make Henry Knox the very first Secretary of War. Okay, so the war is over and we win that war. And how Washington wants to go back to Mount Vernon. He didn't really want to lead the Continental Army, but he's asked now to be our very first president. He doesn't really want to do it either, but he feels he must. It's what's best for the country. So when he's sworn in and he takes the oath, that was 1789. You know, when he's done with the oath, he adds 4 words of his own making to that oath. What are those 4 words? Anyone?
In God we trust.
No. So help me God. Very, very good, Marcia. He added that all on his own, and there has not been a president since that has not quoted that. It was never part of the original oath. He was a humble man, and he recognized where his strength came from and who he needed to depend on. So he's president, and 10 years after that, he dies, 1799. And he has a strange request at his funeral, or not at his funeral, but before dying, is a strange request. He said, promise me that you will not actually bury me until I've been dead for 3 days. Why would he ask such a strange thing? It's now 1799. Exactly. At this time frame, and for a couple more decades into the 1800s, did you realize at this time, one out of every 25 people buried were buried alive. People had not heard of something known as a coma. And so if you didn't move, if you didn't talk, if you didn't sit up, and you had been sick, this is very dangerous. If you had been sick and there was no signs of life, they would have a funeral and bury you. And with so many people, 1 of 25 being buried alive, and they know this from, sad to say, the scratch marks in the inside of the coffins. Okay, so what they started to do then, a decade or so later, when someone died, they decided we're going to tie a little string either on their finger or their toe. We're going to feed that string through the coffin up through the ground and then to a bell right next to their marker, okay? And so if you ever heard the expression saved by the bell, that's where it came from. And in case the bell was ringing at 3 a.m. in the morning, somebody needed to be at that cemetery 24/7. This is where we get the term the graveyard shift. And if you ever heard the expression that somebody is a dead ringer for somebody else that has passed on, that's where we get that expression from, okay? So one thing I'm going to quickly do, I have about 15 minutes left, and in that time frame, I'm going to talk about some expressions from colonial America. But before I do that, there is one other thing that I just want to talk about quickly, or I'll try to do it quickly. Women and the American Revolution. In many, many ways, that revolution was a revolution for women also. You know, the men, they would rush off to war, and they had a specific place, a battle to go to. Very, very different for the ladies. For the women of this time, the war came right to you, to your front door. And then it seeped into every aspect of your life. Day-to-day changes. You know, all those pewter dishes in the hutch, if you're a true American, they need to go. Those can all be melted down for bullets for the boys. You don't need to drink that tea anymore. You can drink coffee or juice. Those fine British goods that you were having imported, dresses and shawls, costumes, don't need them. You learn how to spin and to weave, and you be satisfied with hand-spun goods. And that's where Martha Washington was such a wonderful, wonderful first lady. Because you know, this woman, she never asked another woman to do something she didn't do herself. Whether it was staying for months at end in those horrible, horrible war camps and trying to feed and nurse soldiers, or trying to rally other ladies and having weaving parties, she was always willing to help her country in any way she could. But so the revolution came right to the women. Another way, you probably would not be untouched by the end of the war. Either a husband, a son, a brother, a father would be gone. Sometimes they came back, sometimes they didn't. And if you were the wife or an eldest daughter, it may mean you are now going to take over the family farm, the plantation, the family mercantile, or our business. That means you better know how to do some accounting and have some business acumen. It was a total change for the ladies. Some ladies became spies, some were cooks, some were nurses, some were couriers, some became writers, and some became soldiers themselves. And you may know of the one lady I'm referring to. Her name was Mary Ludwig Hayes. You might know her better as Molly Pitcher. Well, do you know she went to the battle? It was the battle at Monmouth, New Jersey, and it was in June 28th of 1778, one of the hottest days of the year. And she saw the soldiers with nothing to drink. They were so hot. And there was a stench in the air, all the sweat, there was the blood, plus there was all the sting, the smoke of the gunpowder. And they were so parched, they were crying for water. So remember I said some brought their families? So she rallied the women to get pitchers of water and go out to the soldiers. And the first soldier called out, Molly, pitcher. Then another one, Molly, pitcher over here. Molly, I need a pitcher. And all of a sudden, all those women surveyed became Mollies. And they had a pitcher of water. But she was the Molly Pitcher because she was the first to go. And when she did, while she was distributing the water, this very brave lady had to watch as her husband John was shot. He was manning a cannon and he dropped to the side. So she grabs her skirt with all its many petticoats and she rips it, the whole bottom, and she bandages up the best she can. Doesn't panic, doesn't flee. Very brave woman. And then she stays right there and mans, shouldn't call it manning, but mans the cannon, all right? And while she's doing that, there is a cannonball from the enemy side that goes right through her dress. Thank heavens for thick petticoats, because she was saved because of that. Both her and her husband did recover, but sad to say, it was a complete draw and both sides lost a lot of lives. But that's the original Molly Pitcher. And I'll try to wrap this up because I want to talk, I just have a few expressions of that time frame, what we call idioms. You know, if you were a colonist and you had left England, decided to make a place for yourself in the new world, you were a former blue blood, okay? What do we mean by a blue blood? It was believed years ago that the lighter complected you were, the more fair you were, the more you could see someone's veins through their skin, the more blue you were. And that, they believed, was a sign of good breeding. That was being a blue blood, okay? Now, at this time, again, in colonial America, whether you are a woman or a man, you would have been wearing a powdered wig. And if you were out socializing for the evening and you decided, oh, I've been greeting people, we've been dancing, I better head over to the powder room. Had nothing to do with ladies powdering their nose. Men and women went to the powder room because that's where you had your wig repowdered. This is where we get that expression, the powder room. Well, at the end of your socializing and you'd retire at home for the evening, you finally got to take that hot, heavy wig off. And where would you put it? You had a block of wood, and that was your wig rest, and that block of wood was called a blockhead. And that's why still today, someone who's not very bright, all form, no substance, is called a blockhead, okay? So a powdered wig. Now, if you were a very, very influential statesman, politician, and I'm going to give the example close to home, like William Blount. During colonial America, he was our probably greatest man of influence, and he was the one who determined that Knoxville would be Knoxville, okay? But he had a big wig because the more power, more influence you had, the bigger your wig, or higher, I should say, and that's where we get the term a big wig from. Now, did you know that gentlemen years ago, they were always, when dancing or meeting a new lady for the first time, were always to put their best foot forward. By saying that, it was saying the foot that is your most stable and secure, that you can maintain your balance, that's the foot you put forward, because you're going to end up having to bow to the ladies. And when you do, you don't want to lose your balance and flip your lid. That was their term for a wig also. And back then, you may not have realized it. See, men are vain also. That might be news to some, but no. Did you know that they had falsies? Yes. But they were in their stockings. They wanted to impress ladies when they were dancing and when they would bow at their wonderful, strong, muscular calf muscles. So what they would do, they would put or a little spit of sand in their stockings to make it look like they had great calf muscles. But I have to tell you, because I think this is so funny, reading about Alexander Hamilton, he was such a handsome man that the ladies who were single, if they were at a dance or something, they'd say, oh, he doesn't even need any sand in his stockings. Okay, I guess for historians that's as funny as things get, but anyway. So, a powdered wig could be very expensive because usually they were actually made from human hair. But if you could not afford that and you had to have one made from goat's hair, that was a lot less expensive, but the hair was very, very coarse and it did not look realistic. But it also meant it would be almost completely gray in color. So if you had one out of a goat's hair, it didn't matter if you were 20 years old and you wore it, they'd call you an old goat because you were wearing goat's hair. Now, back then, colonial America, we had a lot of tailors. You had custom-made suits, and we had no way to measure things. We didn't have a ruler or a measuring stick. And so if you owned a tailor shop, accuracy was very, very important. And so what they did to measure your customer's inseam, you're going to take a spick, which is a nail, a 2 1/4 inch long, a spick. And then when you're measuring their chest and their waist, you use a span from your little finger to your thumb. And that's why a really, really good tailor shop was always known as being spick and span. All right? They measured accurately. Now, let's say Lou comes into my tailor shop and he says, I want a suit, a 3-piece suit. That means I'm going to have a vest, I'm going to have pants, and I'm going to have a jacket. And I said, oh my goodness, Lou, that's going to take me 9 yards of material. You want the whole 9 yards? Yes. And he said, yes, I do. And that's why when Lou goes walking down the parkway, everybody's going to just look at him and say, my goodness, There goes Lou Bolton. He is dressed to the nines. Took 9 yards. All right. Well, if I'm the tailor and Lou comes in and I'm measuring out some material, but maybe he's just thinking about it. Maybe he's not real serious. But how do I know when he's made a decision? When he's ready to get down to brass tacks. Because on my counter as a tailor, in intervals, set intervals, would be brass tacks. That's what I used to measure out the material. And I knew a sale was certain when I got down to brass tacks. Now, ever heard the word when something is sort of shoddy? Well, men, years ago of means, would wear at home, it wasn't called a slipper, it was a very soft shoe. It was called a slipshod. And you could very easily slip in and out of them. They were so comfortable that some men decided, well, why don't we just not only wear them around the house, but maybe we can wear them down to the store or down to the tavern. Very uncouth. You know what? If a man was seen wearing slipshods in public, that was horrible. It was disgraceful. They said it was slipshod, and then that was shortened to the word shoddy. Very shoddy. You only did that once or twice, and then your wife took care of you. Okay, so once we got rid of the powdered wigs, the next thing, when we start to go to custom felt hats and beaver hats, and Danbury, Connecticut was the millinery capital of America. A milliner is a hat maker. And what happened to make felt, it always requires mercury. That mercury, when heated, causes a very noxious fume. And when you're exposed to that over time in many years, it's going to cause twitching, it causes shakes, it causes stuttering, and it causes all kinds of problems. And that's why millineries became known as Mad Hatters. Okay, I'm going to talk about the women for just a minute and sort of some private things. I hope this will be okay. But, you know, back then, a lot of the women would wear a French-style corset, all right? And it was very important. It had all these stays, and you had to keep them very upright and right in order. And so a woman who had all her stays in place was known as being straight-laced. If you were out in public and you didn't wear a corset, you were called a loose woman. All right? Now, if you are married to a man and there was actually a law at this time on the books, and it said that it was illegal for a man to beat his wife as long as he didn't use anything bigger than the size of his thumb. And that was called a good rule of thumb, something we still use today, right? When you went, you couldn't have your picture taken, of course, with a camera. And if you wanted to have a portrait of your wife and you or your family, and you went to an artist and had this custom done, it was very expensive, especially if you wanted the limbs. If you wanted the artist to do your limbs, it was going to cost you an arm and a leg. All right? Back then, the average colonialist, like you and I, when it was time to go to bed at night and retire, we'd have to hit the hay. And I like this because as a little girl, I remember my dad saying that every night before I'd go to bed. Well, time to hit the hay. Well, your hay was your bed. You would go throughout the house. You would go anywhere if there was outside or in a barn, little pilings of hay all had to be scrunched up together, made a nice bundle for your bed. That's why we still use the expression that we're making the bed. Now, us ladies, if we were using makeup at the time during colonial America, it would have been made from wax. So that's not always a good thing, especially if you had a heavy, heavy layer of makeup on. And let's say you were in the parlor and you were knitting with some friends and your chair was right next to the fireplace. There was a good chance you could lose face. All that wax start dripping down. Then you know what you'd have to do? You'd have to run outside where it was colder to save face. And no matter how good a friend you might be to someone, or even your own sister, you never ever told another woman what was happening to her makeup. It was very, very important. You always had to mind your own beeswax. Could never tell someone else what was happening. Okay, now if you smiled really, really deeply and you had a lot of wax on your face, you might actually break that wax, and that was known as cracking a smile. Right, I'm going to, that's about what I wanted to say with the isms and some of those. And it's almost 10 after 7, and so I'm not sure your time frame, if I should ask for questions or if I've gone too long or...
Go ahead. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask.
You know, there's an Appalachian tradition that's been in this area since I was a small child, that when someone passed away, you never buried the person before 3 days had passed.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder if that tradition arose from what you just told us from years ago, because I know in the mountains, very much everyone was held for at least 3 days.
Yes.
And I never understood exactly why that 3 days was so perfect, but that would
Yes,
explain it.
that's exactly why, and especially in the late 1700s, there was a little girl here by the name of Cora Ogle. And her parents actually had a funeral for her. And while they were at the funeral, her aunt noticed a twitch, and then little Cora sat up. And this is also where we get the tradition of awake starting and why it's called awake. You are going to stay there, somebody 24/7 for 3 days to make sure nobody woke up. And that's why we called it awake. But I have wondered in studying some of this, why 3 days? Why did they choose those 3 days? And I know the people here had a strong faith, and I wondered if it had anything to do with, the resurrection story, but, that seemed to be nationwide. So I'm not sure why they made it 3 days. But yes, you're absolutely right.
I know in our family, and this is even in my childhood, at a death, there was always 2 nights of sitting up with a body, and on the 3rd day, there was a burial, and that was pretty typical of this area.
Yes, and burials in your home. I grew up in North Dakota. Both my grandparents were buried in the home on the farm that they farmed. And all the families came to them. There was no such thing as going to a funeral home or, having embalming professionally done. That was part of why it was also very, very imperative, they felt, to have the body in the ground within such a time frame. But yeah, it was really the responsibility of the family. And in each community, one of the most well-loved and respected people was the coffin maker. And many times they would not ever charge for that. They would say, "This is my gift to the family. Now we would like to do this." And sometimes when I'm on a tour, because I'll talk about the importance of the church bell tolling, and that was indication to us the death of the person and the number of years they lived. But something also that is unique to this area, if you ever go to the Museum of Appalachian Norris, you'll see these. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a death nest or a death crown. If your loved one died in your home and you had a feather pillow, and you would check their pillow the next morning, if they died in their sleep, let's say, you would very, very carefully take it apart, and you were looking for a hard little cluster that looked just like a bird's nest. But they call it a death nest or a death crown. And the tradition was that if you could find one of those, that was a sign from the Lord that your loved one was going on to heaven. One lady on the bus said, well, what if you can't? I said, shucks. No, I don't, no. Go ahead. Lou, did you have a question?
I have two, but you may not have a succinct answer.
Oh.
And I know that's difficult for you.
You're getting the drift. That's so funny.
So if you have a response that you could work in, if Mad King George were not the King of England, do you think we would have had an easier or worse time? But the second question may be more important. Do you have a succinct stuff to talk about the Congress that enacted the Declaration of Independence?
Okay, with King George, our becoming a country was inevitable. And so whether or not he sped that process along or slowed it down, I'm not really sure. And I don't feel I could comment on that. And I need you to, in regard to the Continental Congress and the Declaration, can I ask what specifically, what is your question here?
Well, I just like what you say, and you usually have such nuggets of information and interest. And we know probably the general story. Are there any particulars about the people and the process that stand out in your mind that we could be more enlightened about?
Well, as a person of faith, I really don't think that it was just a coincidence that we had men like Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe and James Madison, who wrote what were called the Federalist Papers, and were also part co-writers with, not for the Declaration, but with Thomas Jefferson and other things. And it's like the Declaration was needed to bring us together and to solidify very succinctly what a whole country was thinking. And Thomas Paine would, right before this, write a book that stirred his book, was it Common Sense? Yeah, Common Sense. That really, really did a lot to solidify Americans for the cause. But, I'm just very grateful, Thomas Jefferson, a true Renaissance man, that these men were so capable, and they were statesmen. They were not politicians. And that is a world of difference, because they did what was best for the country and the people, not for the party. And if we could only get back to that. And this is not being succinct, I know.
For you, it is.
Anita went with me to do a tour to Oak Ridge, and I had originally started doing them about 25 years ago. And on the way back, I cannot help but always say, could we repeat Oak Ridge? In that, would the people today be able to do what the people back then did? And I don't think so. Because, technologically, of course we could do it. We're far beyond that. But what these people did in terms of the sacrifice, do we have Americans today that are willing to have a meatless Monday, a weightless Wednesday, a no-gas Friday for the good of the country and the whole? No. Nor are we teaching the next generation to really know what it means to sacrifice for your country and for something bigger than yourself. And when I think of the generations today, I feel sorry for them because many of them don't know how to live at a level bigger, for something bigger than self. And that's a really, really small world. So I don't know if that was a nugget or if it was just air.
There's one name that you could have mentioned.
Yes.
The fellow that signed the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock.
Yes.
And didn't he do that so he wanted King George to be able to read his name without his glasses? And led to an expression, put your John Hancock.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And I had a few more pages and I saw the time and I figured I better wrap it up, which is another. But yes, you are absolutely right. That is true. Very good.
Don't you think that George Washington lived the ideology that he had led men toward and women toward? He actually lived that when he refused to become a king. And then that was reconfirmed when the Electoral College elected him unanimously. The only person ever elected unanimously through the Electoral College. It was a different day in our country where there was complete unity around living the ideology.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think he lived out the truths that he espoused, and he would always be an example. And if, he wouldn't ask something of someone else that he was not willing to do. Yes, I think that's very, very true. Well, I appreciate it.